Hi everyone, welcome to a new installment of our department's research seminar. This is the Department for Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And our research seminar or our conference speaker series is organized jointly with CELFIS, that's the Center for Logic, Philosophy and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and ICUB, that's the Research Institute in Humanities at the same university. We're delighted to be able to co-host this with CELFIS and ICUB via a postdoc grant that has the following code. The code is, I'm going to recite this from memory because I can't find it right now, but please trust me, it's true. So it's PN-3 Roman PD-1.1-2019-0535, and we're very grateful to our public sponsor. That's the Public Funding Agency for Research, UEFISCD. And tonight's speaker is a long-standing friend and colleague of mine, Ana-Maria Creţu. Ana is a research associate at the University of Bristol currently. And I believe, Ana, your alma mater is the University of Bucharest. And I believe I remember that correctly because we were students at around the same time. So it's quite a pleasure to have you here. And it's a privilege. Perspectival Instruments is the talk of Ana-Maria. Please take it away.
Thanks, Andre, for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. It's a great privilege to speak at this series, which I used to go to as a student, both as an undergrad and master student. So thanks for the invitation. Cool. So let's get started. So I'm going to talk about perspectival instruments. This may be a bit puzzling for at first sight. The idea of the talk is to look into, to try and understand what we might mean by the claim that instruments are perspectival. So how can we understand the perspectivity of instruments, what challenges may arise, what solutions to potential challenges we might be able to offer, and so on. One sec. Okay. So the plan for today's talk is to go through some of the background and some of the challenges that I'll identify, and then I will offer one response to one particular challenge which has sort of two sub-responses. Cool. So the most important, I suppose, the most important clarificatory aspect of the talk is to begin with what I mean by scientific instruments. This is not necessarily straightforward to identify a scientific instrument. There's a lot of literature on definitional debates, on historical debates, and so on. There are references in my paper, which has a link in the chat. So for the purposes of this talk and for the purposes of the paper, by scientific instruments, I mean any apparatus, simple or complex, that is used to investigate the natural world through observation and experimentation. So spectrographs, cloud chambers, microscopes are all scientific instruments. A small caveat before we move on. I do in the paper talk about the Atlas detector at the LHC. So I take that to be a complex scientific instrument, though the present framework is not meant to apply to the digital computer as an instrument, which is used in a lot of contemporary scientific experiments. So I will leave that aside. Cool. Okay, so if you think about scientific instruments, why are they valuable? What do they do? Well, they help us to get knowledge about the world, right? So there's this historical or still lots of, it has still lots of supporters in contemporary philosophy, at least, and science. Actually, I think both philosophy and science, called the objective view. So according to the objective view or the traditional view about scientific instruments, instruments deliver objective knowledge about the world. So we use in instruments, in experiments, and through their use, we get, or they help us within experiments to get objective knowledge about the world. So now, also traditionally, I suppose, there are two main challenges to this objective view about scientific instruments. The first is both, which are, extremely well-known challenges. So I think the theory-laden challenge is known in the literature even before the conceptual relativist challenge. The theory-laden challenge has been proposed and discussed at length by Norwood Hansen, and the conceptual relativist challenge has been mostly associated with the work of Thomas Kuhn. So opposed to the objective view of scientific instruments is first the conceptual relativist thesis, which says that different perspectives or different paradigms, if you want, construct the world differently, and there are no commonly established facts between the two perspectives or paradigms. The theory-laden thesis says that scientists' perspectives will affect their observation and the results that we obtain with scientific instruments. So the theory-laden challenge basically says that there is no cross-perspectival knowledge. Now, most recently, so as I said, those two are well-known challenges. Most recently, a novel view in philosophy of science has been developed by Ronald Geary, Paul Teller, and most recently by Michaela Massimi. So the view is called perspectival realism. And according to perspectival realism, the scientific instruments and the knowledge they deliver is perspectival. So we might want to actually understand what it is to say that the instruments are perspectival. So this is the goal for our talk today. So the perspectival view, which has been primarily the perspectival view of scientific instruments, I should say, has been primarily advocated by Ronald Geary, and more recently has been defended also by Peter Evans in a wonderful paper about perspectival objectivity, which I strongly recommend. So according to the perspectival view of scientific instruments are perspectival and deliver perspectival knowledge. So there are at least two different ways in which we might understand this claim, as alluding to the perspectival features of scientific instruments, or as alluding to some kind of to the dependence of scientific instruments or different kinds of perspectives. So when we think about perspectival features, we might think about the fact that scientific instruments have a limited response to a limited range of aspects of their environment. So for example, telescopes cannot detect positrons. Or we might think that, so the first perspectival feature is that they respond to a limited range of aspects of their environment. Then the second perspectival feature is that their response to the limited range is also limited. And the third perspectival feature of a scientific instrument, at least as identified by Geary, is that there are limitations on input discrimination of the scientific instrument due to the theory-laden aspect. So obviously, scientific instruments are built from a particular point of view and from the viewpoint of a particular theory. So in some sense, they are theory-laden, so they can only, detect, or they can only detect things. Actually, that's not quite right. We'll get to that in a second. So anyway, the third perspectival feature of scientific instruments is that they have limitations on input discrimination. Now, as I said, you can understand the claim as also being about the dependence of scientific instruments on different kinds of perspectives. And this is the understanding that I'm going to spend more time focusing on. So first, I'm going to just review a bit of the literature, and then we can move on to the more constructive bits. So in various of Geary's writings, he defines the perspectivity of instruments in different ways. So you might think that, for example, that scientific instruments are perspectival because they're dependent on an individual's scientist perspective, for example, or they're kind of like their personal point of view. So there is one person who operates the instrument, and the results that come are interpreted by that one person. So in that sense, the instrument may depend on a particular point of view. You might also think that the instruments are perspectival because they depend on the human point of view, or because they depend on the visual point of view. So I think all of these ways of understanding perspectives on which instruments might depend upon are valuable limitations. So they limit the kind of like range of what scientific instruments can do and how they can be interpreted. But I think there's sort of insufficient insights to actually tell us what we might mean by the perspectivity of scientific instruments. So I think we need to look at more specific or fine-grained types of perspectives to actually understand what kind of epistemic challenges might occur from the perspectivity of instruments. So another way, a more kind of like specific way, but I would say not sufficiently, so other specific ways, but not sufficiently fine-grained perspectives on which instruments depend according to Geary are ways of constructing models, particular cultures, the standpoint of a scientific community, or the observational standpoint of an observer or instrument. So I think with this way of understanding perspectives, we're kind of like moving in the right direction, but I still think that they're like not sufficiently fine-grained. They're overly broad ways of construing perspectives, and it doesn't actually tell us what it means for instruments to be perspectival. So I'm going to focus. So there are two fine-grained. There are in the recent literature. There are two other ways of defining, at least two other ways of defining perspectives, which are quite fine-grained. So we can define perspectives as being in a particular way, to be seen in a moment, as broad perspectives or as narrow perspectives. Today, I'll only talk about the dependence of scientific instruments on broad perspectives. You can read about the shameless advertising. You can read about the dependence of scientific instruments on narrow perspectives in my forthcoming paper in philosophy of science. Cool. So, okay. So we said that the perspectival realism is a view that challenges the objective view. We said that the conceptual relativist thesis is one thesis that is problematic for the objective view. I'm going to show that the perspectival realism view can be reframed as posing the same problem as conceptual relativism. I'm going to reframe it slightly in terms of instrumental incommensurability, so show that it leads to the same problem, but I'm going to show that there's a new solution that perspectival realism offers when it comes to the perspectivity of instruments. So first, to do all that, we need to define broad perspectives, understand what they are, and how whether there's a problematic dependence of instruments and why. Okay. So broad perspectives can be, the way I understand broad perspectives, they are similar to Laudan's research traditions. So they encompass methodological norms, they encompass background assumptions, they encompass narrow perspectives, they encompass theories about phenomena, and they encompass theories about instruments, their operation, and their interpretation. Now you can understand broad perspectives so a similar understanding can also be found in Massimi's paper, Michela Massimi's paper from 2018, I think, is this one, the 4 types of perspectival truth. So a broad perspective, Massimi doesn't call it that way, but it can be understood as a broad perspective. So in her work, a broad perspective is the body of scientific knowledge. The body of scientific knowledge claims can be defined as the body of scientific knowledge claims advanced by the scientific community at the time, the experimental, theoretical, and technological resources available to the scientific community at the time to reliably make those scientific knowledge claims, and second-order methodological epistemic claims that can justify the scientific knowledge claims so advanced. So I think it's fairly straightforward to see why this is a broad perspective. It's not a very specific, it's not a very, it is a fine-grained perspective, but it's rather broad. Cool. So we want to understand in what way scientific instruments depend on these kinds of perspectives. And this is how. So each broad perspective can produce through its instruments and outputs its own conceptualization of the world. And in doing that, so if we, in basically producing a conceptualization of the world, it can lead to to the same kind of problem we were talking about at the beginning, to the conceptual relativism. So if we're thinking about broad perspectives as all that we said earlier, and through the kind of things that they contain, they constitute a particular conceptualization of the world, then we may end up in a situation that if and when broad perspectives change, and the change leads to either non-transferable knowledge of instrument building and operation, or non-transferable knowledge delivered by instruments, then this situation would result, it's probably familiar from Kuhn, the paradigm incommensurability. So this situation specifically for instruments would result in what I call instrumental incommensurability, which can come in 3 varieties. So it can be, we can talk, at least in principle, we can talk about the physical non-transferability of instruments. So this is obviously which is to some extent or to a large extent to be expected, because broad perspectives like research traditions are extended in time. So the kind of instruments that are produced along the way of the development of a research perspective are bound to be superseded or to break, or to become unusable. So this, in principle, if this kind of physical non-transferability occurs, this would lead to some kind of incommensurability, right? I think the physical non-transferability of instruments is actually hard to find examples in the history of science, because we cannot know about things that disappeared. And I think even to kind of like cast doubt on this kind of incommensurability and whether it can occur, we can draw examples from so two kind of ranges of examples. So one is the astrolabe, who has been lost for like almost 400 years, but then it has been recovered. So even if physical instruments can, you know, fall in disrepair or disappear, they're not completely lost. And then instruments such as the antique Epigonian and the barbiton have been reproduced, their music has been reproduced only recently. So they're not, even if it seems that they've been lost, they're not really lost. Which actually brings us to the next next type of, or this physical non-transferability is connected to technical non-transferability and the other type of non-transferability. So they all, technical non-transferability means that the kind of knowledge about how to, the know-how and knowledge how to produce instruments and how they're assembled and how they work in experiments, that kind of knowledge is lost. So there are kind of interesting examples of such technical discontinuity, actually. So the Mark Hicks has a very nice book about the Bletchley Park computers and how they've been disassembled and what has been lost through through the disassembling of the computers at Bletchley Park, but particularly focusing on kind of the technical knowledge that has been lost through displacement and I don't know what it's called, when you have lots of people doing lots of different small tasks. Adam Smith calls it in a way that I don't remember how. Anyway, Mark Hicks' book is great. So then we have also conceptual non-transferability of scientific instruments, and this can happen when, so this is a more kind of like interesting case, and the reason this is interesting is because broad perspectives, so as we saw earlier, contain methodological norms, background assumptions, and so on. So amongst the methodological norms that the broad perspective sponsors, and that's quite central to a broad perspective, is the norm of scientific objectivity that is used to do experiments, to obtain knowledge, and so forth. So objectivity norms, which are central to broad perspectives, govern the use of scientific instruments. And because they govern the use of scientific instruments, then if they're contained in the conceptualization of the broad perspectives, when that changes, then the objectivity norms change too, and that, to a large extent, makes the instruments perspectival. So just for clarity, the main idea is that objectivity norms govern the use of instruments. If the objectivity norms are perspectival, then instruments end up being perspectival too. So in what follows, I will show that objectivity remains. What that means is that even if broad perspective change, objectivity standards don't change concomitantly. And even if objectivity standards change, instruments and their outputs don't change concomitantly with the objectivity standards. So I'll defend this claim by looking at two main, by designing sort of two main responses. So first, I will focus on showing that shifts in objectivity standards don't correspond to shifts in broad perspectives. And then I'll go back to examples of instruments. So to do that, we'll first have to understand what objectivity standards we are using, what do we mean by them, and so on. How am I doing for time, Andre? Am I sort of halfway through?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Cool. So should be right on time. Right. So the goal of the first response, that's objectivity-led, is to show that conceptual relativists can be avoided with respect to scientific instruments as long as shifts in objectivity standards are not abrupt and discontinuous and do not correspond to shifts in broad perspectives. So I'm mainly drawing here on the wonderful book by by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. It's called Objectivity. So here it goes. The first standard of objectivity that they identify is, so if you look at the history of science and you look at what kind of objectivity standards people were using and how they were applied to instruments and so on, then the first one that you sort of come across is truth to nature. And truth to nature was, what truth to nature means basically is standard. It means that we acquire objectivity, and when we have acquired standardized types, what this means is that these are specimens of snowflakes, and if you look at them, there's absolutely no distortion to any of them. They're like so if you have like eyeglass piece, then you can see that every single bit is perfect, and there are exactly as many lines on each and so forth. And the reason for that, according to the practitioners of the 17th and 18th century, who thought that truth to nature was the way to go to obtain scientific objectivity, for them, when you were trying to understand, trying to recover knowledge about the world through instruments and so on, nature only gave you a lot of variable tokens. It gave you lots of snowflakes with lots of fleeting features and with imperfect lines and imperfect shapes and so on. So the idea of these practitioners was that all that unruly variability would represent the subjectivity of each person looking at nature. It would not represent an objective view of how nature is. So for them, the unreasoned observations, each person looking at the snowflake and observing all the variability in the snowflakes, those were unreasoned observations, and they were subjective. So to acquire scientific objectivity, you had to select and perfect an archetype, and the archetype would be the idea in the observation, and it was the idea in the observation that was objective. I think people familiar with accounts of natural kinds may find a similar story in some of those accounts still existing in some philosophical accounts. Okay, so this standard of objectivity, as I said, was prominent in 17th and 18th century, but with the advancement of technology, of means of photographing nature, and so forth, it started slowly fading, though it never disappeared. So it gave way to mechanical objectivity. So beginning with the 1830s and up until about 1920s, the dominant standard of objectivity was the new mechanical objectivity. And this was focused on proceduralized automation with helped by the most of the recent technological advancements. And what mechanical objectivity sought to do was to recuperate the variability of the individuals. So scientific practitioners of that time thought that you can only understand nature objectively if you suppress any predilection to prettify, if you have mechanized procedures, or lacking mechanized procedures or automated instruments, if you have human beings acting as well as machines. So if you look at the kind of reproduction of the snowflakes, well, actually, it's not, it's a photograph of the snowflakes. There are details at the end of this, on one of the last slides, with who took the photograph. We don't remember now. So this photograph, I think, was taken in 1902. And if you look at how snowflakes actually look like without, perfecting an archetype, there are lots of, imperfections, right? They're not, that's what happens when you when you identify lots of different, tokens of a type. Cool. So this is another kind of standard of objectivity that can govern the use of instruments and lead to a particular conceptualization of the world. So we're going to go through two more standards of objectivity. The third one started existing largely concomitantly with mechanical objectivity. So the failure to a large extent of automated means of recovering information from nature, or from the failure of humans to act completely as well as machines when operating instruments and gathering information, led some scientific practitioners to give up entirely the idea of recording nature truthfully. So what they thought was that you can only really get objective knowledge about the world if you find the communicable invariants, if you find those invariable structural features that are communicable to one and all. Or as Daphne and Galison put it, if you find the enduring structural relationships that survive mathematical transformations, scientific revolutions, shifts of linguistic perspective, cultural diversity, psychological evolution, the vagaries of history, and the quirks of individual physiology. Those acquainted with structural realism or of a structural realist bent would recognize this form of objectivity as the standard of objectivity that some practitioners desire from our interaction with the world and our interaction with the world to obtain knowledge about the world. So finally, the fourth standard of objectivity that is relevant for our purposes and that Daphne and Galison identifies is trained judgment. So this occurred as a reaction to both mechanical objectivity and structural objectivity. So with the advancement of a lot of kind of like scientific instruments, kind of from the 20s onwards, so with like lots of complex, sophisticated instruments and the advancement of knowledge, we want to say, people realize that the idea of kind of recording nature truthfully without any interpretation or with a perfectly sanitized procedure that recovers only structures doesn't actually give you enough, or in some cases, any knowledge about the world. And even if it does, that kind of knowledge is not necessarily objective. So what the scientific practitioners who sought to, well, scientific practitioners who abided by this kind of standard of objectivity did was to rely on obtaining objectivity, to rely on skilled interpretation. So for them, skills were acquired through sophisticated apprenticeships and allowed one to synthesize, highlight, and grasp relationships of families of phenomena, and to smooth, refine, or classify images. So for them, it was desirable to read, to interpret, to draw salient, significant structures from the morals of an interesting artifact and background. And the human ability to seize pattern and obtain knowledge at a glance was prized over highly sanitized procedures or mechanized procedures to obtain knowledge. So now, why is this history of objectivity important, and how does it bear on scientific instruments? So remember, objectivity standards are central to broad perspectives, and they govern the use of scientific instruments. So if the objectivity standards are perspectival, then the instruments are perspectival too. So the purpose of going through the history of objectivity and presenting each particular standard was to show that if you take the scholarship on the history of objectivity at heart, or like at face value, then it suggests that objectivity standards are not tied to any broad perspective. And if they are perspectival, they are so in a much broader sense. So if you look at the kind of range of each particular objectivity standard, it was 1880s through 1920s, or 1830s to 1920s. There were lots of different broad perspectives that shifted in and out within this period of time. So that is one reason to think that they're not tied to any particular broad perspectives. And even moreover, when broad perspectives change, objectivity standards do not change concomitantly. We'll talk about this more later as well, but for now, an example would be quite instructive. So Lorentzian ether theory and special relativity are both different perspectives on the world, different broad perspectives on the world, but they were both governed by structural objectivity. So this shows that when we change from Lorentzian ether theory to special relativity, the objectivity standard didn't change concomitantly. So with the change in broad perspectives. And finally, the third kind of lesson we can draw here is that even if objectivity standards are perceived as in some way perspectival, continuity in objectivity standards over and above changes in broad perspectives should suffice to avert conceptual relativism in relation to scientific instruments. So this is the first response to reframing conceptual relativism as instrumental incommensurability. Now, I said that there is another response, and this is related. So some of you may already ask, well, what if broad perspectives are broader? What if they're not like just the way you define them, and they're like, even broader? So what if the objectivity standards themselves define the perspectives, and when they shift, the instruments and their deliverances also shift? This would obviously lead to conceptual relativism. So I'm going to say, well, it won't, because we have reasons to think it doesn't. So we'll now, for the remainder of the talk, focus on the instrument-led response to instrumental incommensurability. And we want to say that, well, I want to say, or I want to persuade you that instruments and their outputs typically do not change when objectivity standards change. Okay, so basically when objectivity standards shift, scientists who adhere to the new predominant standards can nevertheless use the instruments designed according to previous objectivity standards, and the outcomes of such instruments are not typically contested either. So that's that's what I want to show, and I will show this in relation to two brief examples or case studies, as you want to call them. I suppose examples is better here. So I'll look briefly at the history of the cloud chamber and the history of astrophysical classifications to persuade you that we can avoid instrumental incommensurability. Okay, so the first example to talk about is the cloud chamber. You may all be very familiar with this picture or with the cloud chamber in general. It's a fascinating instrument. You may or may not know that it has its origin in the Victorian period, and was its precursor was an instrument designed by John Atkin to reproduce mimetically natural phenomena such as storms or clouds or okay. Cool. So just before my internet dropped, I was talking about the cloud chamber. I will now resume the short history of the cloud chamber to show how we can avoid instrumental incommensurability when we look at the instruments and their relation to objectivity standards. So the cloud chamber was invented by C.T.R. Wilson in 1911. Wilson's main interest was in atmospheric phenomena, and in 1911, when he invented the cloud chamber, he was working under the auspices of mechanical objectivity. So Wilson is also the first person to have recorded a golden event. A golden event is also what you see in the picture on the slides. That's a golden event of the positron rather than alpha rays that were discovered pioneered as golden events to some extent by Wilson in 1911. So golden events are what Gallison and others, or people would call images, or they're the kind of images recorded of nuclear phenomena or high energy physics phenomena that you can record on a photographic plate. So have a right. So the first golden event was recorded in 1911 by C.T.R. Wilson under the auspices of mechanical objectivity. After this event, seeing the potential of the cloud chamber for studying kind of atomic phenomena, nuclear phenomena. The Cavendish physicists sort of appropriated the cloud chamber, and they used it ever since, well, up to the 40s, more or less. They used it to, you know, take photos of the subatomic phenomena. So in a slightly modified form, the cloud chamber was used by Carl Anderson to take not one, but two photographs of golden events. So Carl Anderson discovered the positron in 1932. So that's the lovely track of the positron there on the slides. And with Seth Nedermeyer, they later discovered the muon also. So they took another golden event in 1936. Importantly, so the reason why I'm kind of talking about what we did with the cloud chamber and how many different golden events we recorded is because these are still, we still recognize this as golden events, and we still recognize the cloud chamber as an instrument that gives us objective knowledge about subatomic phenomena. So in the history of the cloud chamber, different events were recorded under different standards of objectivity. So the alpha ray golden event was recorded with mechanical objectivity in mind. The positron and the muon were then recorded with trained judgment in mind, and so on. So there's the cloud chamber spans a significant portion of the history of objectivity, but straddles different standards of objectivity. So this is to say that instruments and their deliverances can be markedly cross-perspectival, even when perspectives are defined by the objectivity standards themselves. So despite being built or used to deliver data under the auspices of one objectivity standard, the instrument and the data produced often successfully survive shifts in objectivity standards. So as I said, the use and importance of the cloud chamber and golden events cuts across both probe perspectives and changing objectivity standards, and is thus markedly cross-perspectival. Okay, so last bit on the agenda today, the second example to show how shifts in objectivity standards don't correspond to shifts in the instruments and data themselves, is to show that, is to look briefly at the history of astrophysics and especially the history of stellar classifications. So you have on the slides a picture of the human computers at the Harvard Observatory. I think Antonia Mori there, Annie J. Cannon there, and I'm not entirely sure if that's Wilhelmina Fleming. Anyway, so the Harvard Observatory in the 19th century was hired human computers, mostly women, to act as willless machines to record automatically through highly proceduralized rules and so forth, through automated means to record nature. So that was, to them, the only way to obtain objective knowledge about stars and about stars. So am I interrupting again? Is that, oh, cool. So the Harvard Observatory started producing catalogs, also scientific classifications of stars based on stellar spectra, based on basically photographs of stars. Can explain in the Q&A what spectrographs are. So the Harvard Observatory started producing catalogs of stars based on stellar spectra in 1890s. That's the first John Draper Catalog of Stellar Spectra. Then a second installment came in 1897, a third in 1901, and two more in 1918 and 1924. All these classifications and catalogs are to some extent still surviving today. But most importantly for our story, although all these installments of the Henry Draper catalog were produced with mechanical objectivity in mind, they were invaluable to the next catalog, the next significant catalog of stars designed by Morgan, Keenan, and Kellman. This was the Atlas of Stellar Spectra produced in 1943. And Morgan, Keenan, and Kellman were advocates of trained judgment, and they produced new photographs, they offered the different analysis, but they counted the Henry Draper catalog as the main precursor and the and thus invaluable to their work on classifying spectra. So why am I saying this? The point I'm trying to make is that even when certain instruments become obsolete, so Morgan, Keenan, and Kellman use different telescopes to obtain the photographs, the deliverances of the obsolete instruments retain their original authority despite shifts in objectivity standards. So the stellar spectra that were took with a different instruments and were used for the Henry Draper memorial retain their original authority despite shifts, despite the shift from mechanical objectivity to trained judgment. Cool. So the conclusion of this very brief case study is that the photographic plates of the spectra that became available towards the end of the 19th century with the invention of the spectroscope cut across shifting objectivity standards. And if you want to know more about the Harvard Observatory, I can recommend the Dava Sobel book, The Glass Universe, which is an amazing read. Cool. So I hope I convinced you that changes in objectivity standards have not transformed or denied the significance of either the cloud chamber or spectrographs, and that conceptual relativism, reframed as instrumental incommensurability, can be avoided when instruments and their deliverances survive shifts in both pro-perspectives and objectivity standards. So I won't have time to, there is one more bit. So I suppose the final sort of conclusion is that scientific instruments themselves and the standards of objectivity governing them equally constitute tools to block conceptual relativism brought about by instrumental incommensurability. And thus to the title of the paper and the kind of final conclusions about the perspectivity of instruments, the goal of this talk was to show that the perspectivity of instruments is best understood as the dependence of instruments on different kinds of perspectives, but instead of constituting a novel epistemic challenge, the dependence of instruments on broad perspectives, when closely analyzed, provides instead the means to mount a novel response to the old epistemic challenge of conceptual relativism. So scientific instruments themselves and the objectivity standards governing them constitute tools to block this old challenge that perspectivism is meant to bring about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much to Dr. Creţu for her presentation. We very much appreciate it. I'm sure everyone here is using the virtual applause button. We would have very much enjoyed to be able to applaud in genuine fashion, but we very much hope to have you give a talk in Bucharest as soon as pandemic, well, as soon as the gods will allow, let's put it that way.
Sounds like a plan.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And if you'd like to ask a question, please make yourselves known either in chat or by raising a virtual hand or in some way, shape, or form. This would be an ideal time to do it. Vladimir, please go ahead. Vladimir Timoshenko is a master's student in the Mind the Brain program at the University of Bucharest. We're delighted to have you here, Vladimir. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation, Anna. I would like you to provide your favorite example of conceptually non-transferable knowledge from history of science.
Cool.
And if I may add to Vladi's question, if you could possibly do so in less than a few hours, just so given the time constraints for you, and I'm sure that there's a rich history to that. And
would you like me to give a brief answer, Andrei?
No, that's
Conceptual.
I think that is a very good question. I think when you talk about conceptual non-transferability, you'd be talking about so I'll rephrase your questions to give the answer.
I might try.
I don't think there is. I think you asked me to offer a favorite example of conceptual non-transferable knowledge. I don't think there is conceptual non-transferable knowledge. That was one of the main points that is one of the main points I'm trying to establish in the paper. I think in the philosophical literature and the history and philosophy of science literature, lots of people take different paradigms to be incommensurable, right? So if you think about Newtonian mechanics, this is the classic example, Newtonian mechanics, or at least particular aspects of Newtonian mechanics and relativity, so it's the theory of relativity, then lots of people argue that the concept of mass, for example, is non-transferable from one theory or one paradigm to the other, right? So this would be a case of conceptually non-transferable knowledge from one paradigm or one broad perspective to the other. Now, conceptual non-transferable knowledge as regards to scientific instruments, I don't have a particular example. I don't have a particular example at hand because I don't think there are, yeah.
And just as a thanks so much, Anna, and just so I make sure, this is going to be a very brief follow-up to Vladi's question, so apologies to Don for waiting. Just so I make sure, you don't need to have an example for that, right? So it's not, yeah.
I think the point that I was making in the talk and the point that I'm making in the paper as well is that at least in principle, you can imagine the non-transferability of instruments to take these three different forms. Now that in principle, these three different forms can occur, and them actually having occurred in the history of science, there are two different claims, and I'm arguing that such non-transferability hasn't actually occurred.
Right.
That is hard to find examples of any such occurrences.
Right. Thanks so much. Next up, we have Dr. Dan Zeman. Dan, please go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Ana-Maria. Good to meet
you. Nice to finally meet you.
Yes. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask this. So, I mean, I'm obviously not familiar with any of the things that we're talking about, but I'm wondering at the end, why, I mean, in what sense you can still call these instruments perspectival? Because, if something is perspectival, then presumably it varies with, something that we call perspective, right? And so you went to several options. You said, okay, they don't vary with the broad perspective. They don't vary with the standards of objectivity. And I don't know what you're saying about the narrow perspectives, but I probably would say that they don't vary with that either, or maybe not. But anyway, so the question is like, okay, you have kind of exhausted the main options of relativizations, and they are not relative or perspectival in that sense. So why keep calling them perspectival instruments? Of course, you mentioned that there is this perspectivality coming to them, attached to them in the sense that they have the limitations, so on and so forth. But that, I mean, that doesn't seem to be like a, or maybe that's the sense, but like it doesn't seem to be like a terribly interesting philosophical concept, right? That instruments are limited by the people who make them, by what you're looking for, and so on and so forth. So if you could address that, I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's the fact that they don't vary in some cases, that doesn't mean that they cannot in principle vary. So the instruments and their data, sometimes, I'm not sure if sometimes or often, I'm not sure if often, but certainly sometimes they do vary with broad perspectives, or as I will show later, with narrow perspectives too. So the point is to say that even if they do vary, and even if they are in this sense dependent, and even if they're dependent on a broad perspective, or even if they're dependent on objectivity standards, and in this sense you take them to be perspectival, this does not lead to conceptual relativism. So the point is to show not that they're not perspectival, because they are perspectival in two important senses, in the sense that they're dependent on these kinds of perspectives, but even when they are perspectival, there are solutions to the problems that occur when this kind of perspectivity occurs.
Yeah, right. But I mean, can I have a follow-up, Andre? Short one. But then, I think I'm getting a bit puzzled. I mean, I was puzzled about this at the beginning as well. So what exactly is the dialectic here? What exactly are we trying to show? So in some cases, those vary with the instruments vary, like they're perspectival in the sense that they're relative, or they vary with the broad perspectives or objectivity standards. And maybe in some cases, that kind of variation could lead to relativism, or some kind of relativistic sounding thing, right? When you're showing that in some cases it doesn't.
I'm showing that we have a strategy to understand whether it does or it doesn't, right? So I think to show that it does or it doesn't, you have to look at each particular case. It's a case-by-case verdict and analysis, right?
Right.
So that's, yeah.
But so let me ask you this: if I'm a conceptual relativist, is it enough? I'm thinking it would be enough for me to find one case in which this kind of variation gives me some relativist support, some kind of relativist take, right? And that if that's true, then it doesn't matter how many other instances you're giving me in which that variation doesn't support this relativist take, because I made my point, right? I mean, as far as I understand, that's how I think a conceptual relativist would say. It doesn't have to be in all cases, right? There might be all kinds of variations, but I
think it's the other way around to some extent.
Okay.
That if you are a conceptual relativist, and I give you a case where, or I give you a strategy whereby at least some paradigm changes or some perspectival changes don't lead to incommensurability, then I think I've offered the strategy to show that the challenge can be avoided. That doesn't mean it will be avoided in every case, but it can be avoided, right? Because I gave you an example to show, well, look, there are these cases in which it doesn't lead to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I don't think we agree with respect to what's the force of the relativist view, right? Because I mean, if you have let's assume that the opposition to relativism is objectivity or something, then that should, because it's objectivity, it should hold in all cases. If you find one case in which it doesn't.
Well, but
then
that's
I mean, that's one way to conceptualize. I don't know, because otherwise you kind of get, I mean, what are the theses that we discussed, right? What are the, what's the thesis? That sometimes things are objective, that doesn't work, right? But saying that sometimes things are relative, that's relativistic enough. Anyway, but this is a bit like.
No, I think that you need to be clear. I think the point one of the points I was making also that when you say that something is perspectival, or when you say that something is objective, you're actually not really saying much unless you're fine-graining what you're saying. And when you're fine-graining what you're saying, then you have, you can have a structured discussion with, you can identify specific challenges to which you can or may be able to offer specific responses. If you were asking me whether I gave an answer to global conceptual relativism, no, I haven't. I gave you a strategy by which you can respond to particular conceptual relativist challenges.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So with due deference to Catalina and Vladimir, I was hoping to interject a follow-up of my own. And I'm just simply going to abuse my privilege as a chair here. And this was initially meant as a separate question, but I think it ties in so well with the exchange between Dan and Dana that it might just fit as a follow-up. So here it goes. That was a long-winded intro for a follow-up, but okay. So the way I took what you were doing, Dana, was something like this. Well, look, there's these people who talk about the perspectival character of instrument readings or something like that. And suppose they were right. Well, how would the argument go? How could the argument possibly go? And it seemed to me as the argument you were making was, well, the ineliminable perspectival character in a relativistic sense, say, in the sense of, well, say, conceptual relativism or whatnot, would follow from non-transferability. But how would non-transferability work? Well, you'd have to have some kind, would follow from incommensurability, okay? But how could we get that? Well, maybe we could get it via non-transferability. But how could we get non-transferability? Well, there'd have to be some kind of shifts in background perspectives, and these would have to be broad, and broad perspectives would include narrow perspectives. So each wiggle in a narrow perspective would trigger a wiggle in a broad perspective. So in a sense, I thought that the work you were doing was constructive in as much as, well, if you think of perspectival instruments, what on earth could deliver that? Well, here's an argument. And now let's inquire into the premises of that argument, right? And I thought that there was this kind of negative logical role that perspectival realism was playing, Massimi's view or something like it, Guillory's perhaps, and well, perhaps Massimi's more than Guillory's, but never. Anyway, so I thought that the point was that, look, it's enough to say that perspectival realism hasn't at all been ruled out in various of these cases to show that the argument doesn't work. The conclusion doesn't follow, right? So,
if I may.
No, sorry. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
No, it was more to show, just to kind of like try to give this partly the genesis of the paper too, in a sense. So the idea is indeed to show, to try and see what is the point of making a claim about the perspectivity of instruments, right? So it's mainly to understand what can we possibly mean by the fact that instruments are perspectival, right? So then I kind of go through all the different, or not all, I go through a variety of different options because it's not an exhaustive list. I'm going through different options of what you might mean by the perspectivity of instruments. And it seems to me most charitable to construe Giri's claim as to the perspectivity of instruments as instruments being dependent on different kinds of perspectives, right? So that's to some extent so far interpretational stuff. So then once you get to that point, then you might wonder, well, that's well and good, but what does that really tell us? Is that the challenge to knowledge that we get from instruments? Is that something that instruments do and we didn't know they do? What is the benefit of acknowledging this kind of dependence? And then I'm showing that acknowledging this kind of dependence does not lead to any new epistemic challenges. It leads to these two old epistemic challenges, theory-ladenness and conceptual relativism. But if you look in detail at the kind of perspectives that instruments depend upon, then those perspectives would give you the tools, would give you some sort of heuristic measure to have developed new responses to these two old epistemic challenges. So that's the, more or less the structure of the paper and the kind of starting point and dialectic. I'm not arguing against the conceptual relativists as such. I'm arguing against the conceptual relativist challenge that perspectivalists can be said to bring about in connection to scientific instruments.
Right, but if I could counterpoise there right for a second, it seemed to me, I sort of followed what you were saying, and it seemed to me I sort of followed Don's question as well. And so just shifting burden there. So clearly, in a lot of views, conceptual relativism isn't a matter of pure logic. So clearly, when you're saying that we could account for perspective relative instrument readings or something like that, we can do so without appealing to conceptual relativism, right? And when you're saying that, there's some kind of perspectival realism in the background, some kind of perspective transcendent notion of objectivity. And if so, the question would then be,
can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. Because
I'm not sure I get the challenge.
Okay, yeah. So and apologies. Sorry to Catalina and Vladimir for waiting. But I thought, and Don, please correct me if I'm wrong here. I thought the point was that if you could account for the perspective relative account of readings that instruments provide in a way that doesn't have the flavor of conceptual relativism, right? Then there seems to be some kind of perspective transcendent notion of objectivity at play. And this was the first part of, this was your reply to the first objection, right? And if so, there seems to be some kind of perspectival realism in the offing, well, in the background, right? And a conceptual relativist, I was wondering if Don is coming from, that's where he's coming from, could say, well, what are the chances of that? The argument that you're making against the relativist is only going to be as strong as the support there is for that kind of perspective transcendent objectivity.
But bear in mind, I have not defended perspectival realism. I have defended the fact you are correct. Like, I think my claims were, I wasn't making as strong claims as you took me to make, because my only point was, my only goal was to show that there can be continuity, not of any particular objectivity standard or not of any particular realist view or what, but that there can be continuity between two broad perspectives or paradigms, if you will, right? So if you want to interpret that as some kind of metaphysical type of objectivity, then I stop you right there, because I haven't actually made that move, and I don't think I need to commit myself to that kind of move, because I was I was offering an epistemic solution to an epistemic problem, not a metaphysical solution to a metaphysical problem. So when I talk about conceptual relativism, I talk about it in epistemic terms, not in metaphysical terms.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that actually helps me sort of get a firmer grip on what the project is. And
should be read purely epistemically or methodologically, not metaphysically.
Yeah, thanks so much. Don, do you have a quick comeback or okay? Okay, thanks. So next up we have Cătălin. Cătălin, please go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is now too simple for where the discussion went, but still I will still ask it. So my question is why we don't take maybe the simple view that in the end instruments appear as a result of a scientific theory, what you call the broad view. We are now making the Large Collider in Geneva because we think that we may discover, we have a theory about some particles, and this is how an instrument came to be. And actually, if we look back, all instruments came as a result of a scientific theory, broad or maybe more narrow. So why we then need to go to make extra explanations for this view?
Thank you for the question. So I think I'm fine with saying that instruments are the product of a scientific theory. Often, well, not often, they're always, are designed from the viewpoint of one scientific theory. Then they are calibrated from the viewpoint of different scientific theories, and they're recalibrated as we kind of like go along and use them a long time, because it can happen, and again, I don't know whether it often happens, but it definitely sometimes happens, that the theory which we use to build the instrument has been shown to be false or has been superseded by another theory. So then because that's sometimes happen, we want some form of, we want arguments to show that despite the fact that that theory was false, the instrument itself, or the data that it has produced within that theory, can nevertheless be used, is often used, and constitutes part of our story about scientific progress.
But
So
this happens only because it's in agreement with current scientific theory, right? Because if it will be a measurement that now there was, let's say we are measuring ether, right? And then we had a flowed instrument that measured ether. And now we will not use those measurements because they are now, they don't go with the current theory, right? There is no ether. We will still use measurements just because they are still in accordance with the current theory. So I don't think it's an explanation of why we are, I don't think it answers to the question why we should not keep only this relationship between theory and instrument.
Because we want to keep the data as well. We want to keep so an instrument can give you various types of measurements, but measurements aren't the only data that an instrument can give you, right? They can give you golden events or whatever, that there are different types of, so I'm not sure what's the...
Okay, so let me put it in maybe more clear. So So let's suppose that we have a new theory. Let's say we have Einstein's theory, right? In Einstein's theory, of course, we know that many of the things that were true in Newton are not true in Einstein, but some of them, they are still true. We are using those
It depends who
measurements.
you ask, but yeah,
Sorry?
I think
Yeah.
it depends who you ask. Sam Fletcher has an awesome paper in which he shows that it's not as incommensurable as people take it to be. So at least in some, yeah.
No, I was just saying that we are still using many of the instruments and measurements we are doing during Newton and after Newton until Einstein, just because it doesn't, I mean, we can still repeat it now in current scientific theory, and it's still valid, right? Otherwise, we'll just dismiss it. And I'm sure that there are plenty of examples where we are actually dismissing measurements because of a new theory that actually shows that we thought is correct and now is not correct. But this is my point. So anyway, as I said, you answered to.
But that's a point. But that's about point about the theory. That's not the point about the instruments. So again, I'm not trying to establish theoretical continuity between different theories. What I was showing, what I take myself to show is that there can be continuity at the level of the instruments and what the instruments tell you about the world, right? And to the answer that I gave to your question was not, I don't have an answer to the theoretical continuity because I'm not necessarily interested in that, and that's not part of my project. But I think I do give an answer for why you need instrumental continuity or continuity of the data, and why you need to show that there is such continuity, because you are still using instruments, for example, that were designed from the vantage point of a theory that has been abandoned. So then you want to have a justification for why, despite the fact that the theory was abandoned, you're still using that kind of instrument or the data that the instrument gave you.
That's a good point.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's the answer. That's the only answer I can give within this framework. Any further answer about theoretical continuity will need a different project. That's
Okay.
a
Thank you.
large project on this.
All right, thanks so much. And we have a last question from Vladimir. Please go ahead.
Thank you, but I actually wanted to show some examples of what Katalin just said. I've come up with at least 3 different practices and tools which became obsolete through the paradigm shift and shift in the objectivity standards. I've remembered that 18th century naturalists liked atlases of human body, and they according to truth to nature principle, they made depictions of human fetuses in their early development, and they have this misconception that in our early stages, human fetus comes through all the evolutionary stages of the humankind, from fish to mammal. And of course, they depicted them the same way as they imagined from those they have available. So like with scales, like small reptilian-like figures, and all of this artistic variability becomes obsolete once sonography was introduced, when people were able to through ultrasound access the
that's compatible with what I said. That's perfectly compatible with what I said.
Yes, you responded to Catalin, yes, about that. That is still the paradigm has shifted. Some theory becomes obsolete, but instruments can be still seen as a history of science, not actually.
Yeah, but that doesn't, again, so I haven't said that all instruments survive paradigm shifts. I've said that some instruments survive paradigm shifts, and that's enough to respond to this instrumental incommensurability, which is a reframing of the problem of conceptual relativism from the point of view of the perspectivist. So I haven't said that I don't think anyone can make that kind of strong claim that all the, I don't even know why you would make those kind of claims, because if you read anything about the history of science, or if you take yourself to, you know, believe in the progress of science, you would know you can make progress by, you know, tweaking an instrument or making a better instrument, or, you know, so you don't have to retain them because you want to make progress, right? But in this progress, there must be, or not there must, this is a must, maybe too much in the line of a metaphysical claim. There can be, or at least we might want to know whether there is some continuity. And if we want to know and show how we can obtain continuity, well, then we look at so-called examples of non-continuity and see whether people maybe have missed something there and there is some continuity, or we just, you know, show that some people define some paradigms. We can identify some paradigms that are alleged to be incommensurable and show that there is some form of continuity across those paradigms.
Thank you so much, Ana, for the reply. And Vladimir, I'm quite sure that Dr. Creţu would be happy if you were to send her a quick email with the examples from the history of medicine that seem to illustrate the points that she's making.
That's completely fine. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
And that's just beautiful. We have the CELFIS speaker series enabling international and institutional cooperation. That's just fantastic. We have a quick follow-up from Dr. Zeman. Dan, please go ahead.
I mean, this is not entirely serious, but I'm thinking, I mean, one reason that instruments survive paradigm shift and all that is that because they're super expensive, right? It would be completely irrational, I would think, to just throw away an instrument without like making sure that you can get some use out of it, right? And if that's like, you know, just reading the readings of some data or something like that, giving you some data, that's perfect, right? So I mean, this is not an argument or anything, but I'm thinking like from a practical point of view, it totally makes sense, doesn't it? Seems to me. And of course, it has to be able to be utilized in the new paradigm, but right. Sorry, that was my whole comment.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah. As far as I know, can you still hear me?
Yeah, but you're not moving, so.
Hello, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
I don't know what's going on.
Now we can also see you move, so there is progress. There's definitely
Good, good.
Thanks so much once again for being with us. Thanks so much to Dr. Creţu for her talk. And we had a follow-up from Dr. Zeman. Apologies for all the interruptions. Dan, please go ahead.
I'm happy to yield. Let's move to the other questions, maybe. So that
I was going to say something to your previous point, Dan, that
okay.
Not only, so kind of like instruments are expensive, but they weren't always expensive to make. But the point about, so like the Atlas detector of a DLHC or whatever, when you design a new instrument, you have to show that it can recover the data of previously used instrument. There's a progression from one instrument to another. So you have like, when you, the one case I know about BEST, is the nuclear emulsions used to photograph again subatomic phenomena at Bristol. To show that they can actually photograph those kind of events, they were always compared with the cloud chamber. So you show that the new instrument can reproduce at least the standard or paradigmatic events that are produced by the most reliable instrument before it.
Oh,
And,
yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know
and
that.
they've done the same. Like if you read Alan Franklin's work, he's gonna have loads of examples in which he shows how the Atlas detector, or I'm not entirely sure if he talks about the LHC experiments or the Opera, can't remember which one he talks about, but he has lots of examples in which he shows how the previous measurements were redone by the new experiment. That's part of the calibration of the instrument.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks so much. And one final question to wrap the evening comes from Steph, and I believe that there's a bit of a mic problem with Steph. So with his permission, that's already being read, and I'm just going to read his question. And he says here in chat, quote, do you see any danger, epistemologically speaking, in preserving this perspectival attribute of instruments when the main theory is changed, parenthetically, when conceptual realism occurs, end quote.
I can't see the question in the chat. Can you put the question in the chat as well, just so I can glance at it?
Yes, I will do just that.
Whilst I think about
yeah, there you go. Whoops. Here it is again. Yes.
So do I see any danger in preserving perspectival attribute of instruments when the main theory is changed? It depends which perspectival attributes, because some of them are non-negotiable to some extent. So like the limitations to it, so the kind of energy range, that's actually, in some instances, they're non-negotiable. In some instances, they can be extended. So like the limitations of microscopes, for example, they there are some limitations in the original theory, but as you tweak the microscope, it's the same instrument to some extent, or maybe you want to say, well, is it? Anyway, so if you take that the instrument in its all the tiny incremental developments is still the same instrument, then with these minor technological tweaks, you are able to shift some of the perspectival features, because the range of the microscope, so the microscope becomes more powerful. You can see more detail, so the limitations are different. So in that, because of that, then danger in the preserving perspectival attribute of instruments. No, not as such, because I think it depends on which perspectival feature, it depends what role it plays, and so on and so on. But at least in the case of the microscope that I described earlier, it is certainly advantageous to not preserve the particular limitations of the initial microscope, right? Because you kind of, so for example, not preserve the energy range limitation or whatever, because you want to, yeah.
All right, thank you so much for answering. And I have to say that these internet connections going up and down just remind us all of technological fragility. And we're very grateful for your heroical overcoming of these limitations, and for your talk and for answering all our questions. Thank you so much, Ana, and very much looking forward to having you again here for another talk.
Thank you, Andre, and thanks everyone for the questions and the discussion. And really, really sorry again for the internet disruptions. Yeah,
It's totally fine. Thanks.
hope